Allahu Akbar. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahmanir-Rahim. Maliki Yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdinas siratal mustaqim. Siratal ladzina an'amta 'alaihim ghairil maghdubi 'alaihim waladdallin. Allahu Akbar.
مشاهدينا مساء الخير. قالوا أن قيامها بالإمامة من علامات يوم القيامة، بتؤم المسلمين رجالا ونساء في الصلاة. أني زونفيلد، أهلا بيكي.
Zonneveld is an imam and founder president of Muslims for Progressive Values. She joins us from Los Angeles.
Freedom of expression and religion is one of our principles.
Oftentimes the media asks, well, where are the progressive Muslims? Well, in the Muslim world, they're either jailed, tortured, or killed.
The argument that we always try to make is to go back to the Quran, the positive story of the Quran, and how wrong the practice is.
On gender issues as well, it's incredibly oppressive. And it is really the antithesis of the nature of Islam. The first converts to Islam were women because it really spoke to women.
A lot of Muslims come to us and condemn us. This is a Western creation and so on and so forth. But the truth is that the first female imam was appointed by Prophet Muhammad.
This is our community praying, men and women together, unsegregated. We must attack, make war on these heretical teachings before it goes too far and poison Muslims who are ignorant. And then another comment is, apostates like this, their blood is halal, permissible for execution. Just slaughter them. So, just cut their heads off. I think that's good enough.
All right, so I'm going to start with my far left, Yasmin Kadir. She's the first full-time employment of Muslims for Progressive Values, and she's actually my assistant, and she does a lot of things for me where I drop the ball. And she's a lifelong intersectional human rights and social justice activist who graduated from Cal Poly SLO in business management and human resources. She's also a part of the Muslim Jewish Fellowship in Los Angeles that focuses on building Muslim-Jewish relations. Roaming Millennial, Lauren Chen, is a political and social commentator and host for the CRTV show Roaming Millennial, Uncensored. She began as a YouTuber just over 2 years ago and has since gained over 20 million views on the platform and hundreds and thousands of followers. She has also appeared on Fox, The Daily Wire, Rebel Media, PragerU, and the Rubin Report. The topics Roaming is most passionate about include individual liberty, gender equality, and include issues surrounding race. She was born in Canada and raised in Hong Kong, and has a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science with a minor in Middle East Studies and Arabic. She's a Leon Burger owner. You know what? I had to look that one up. An enthusiast. And the third panelist that we have here is Nayyera Haq Nayyera. She's a Sirius XM host, a national security analyst. You may have seen her on MSNBC, CNN, and Bill Maher's show. She served in government for 15 years, most recently in the Obama White House, and as a senior advisor at the State Department. And my name is Ani Zonneveld, and you will get to know me a little bit too much probably by the time that we're done with this panel. as this documentary, Al-Imam, is about me and the work that I've done with Muslims for Progressive Values. I'm originally from Malaysia, born there, raised in a very traditional Muslim family, and came to the United States when I was 18 to go to college, graduated, and moved to LA to pursue my passion in music. So I was in the music business for about 25 years before becoming an activist. So that, for me, in a nutshell, that is my personal background. So this is an all-female panel, and what we wanted to do was to frame the conversation here at Politicon as the politicization of religion and culture to advance one's political narrative, both on the right and on the left. And what is really missing in the conversation are the voices of progressive Muslims, which, according to Pew, makes up the majority of American Muslims. 75% of American Muslims actually find inspiration, spiritual inspiration, outside the mosque. So I think that says a lot. But yet you don't hear that 75%, except for Nayyera, on these on these television shows. But you don't actually hear our faith perspective on these media. It's always being debated by those actually that are more driven by politics than by faith and spirituality. And so this is the framing that we want to take this discussion. So the first question that I have is, as Muslims and in the West, do you feel responsibility to critique the Muslim community, extremism, prove that Islam is a religion of peace? And I actually want to start with Lauren, because you are not a Muslim, but as someone who has studied the Middle East and as someone who has also minored in Arabic, I think it's important to start off with someone like your perspective of a non-Muslim.
Well, like you said, I am a non-Muslim, but in my shows, the videos that I do, we spend some time doing things like critiquing Islam, but we also do other things like, interview people like Imam Tawhidi, who is a Muslim reformer and is, very, very progressive when it comes to the faith. And the challenge that I think I've encountered the most when trying to navigate the issue of, both critiquing extreme Islam and also pointing out the fact that the majority of Muslims are peaceful is that there's a lot of stereotyping and I think ignorance from people on both sides of the issue. So when it comes to the idea of does Islam equal peace, I think there are so many people out there who are seeing things from a narrative that is, like you kind of said before, I think is influenced by political views. Right. And so, if I do a video critiquing anything about extremism, I might have some people who have their own political ideology who might criticize me as being racist or Islamophobic or, any one of those things. Whereas if I try to talk about the fact that, if you go to a lot of the countries where we see our hotbeds of extremism now, places maybe like Iraq and Afghanistan, 50, maybe 60 years ago, this was definitely not the case, right? We had women in the workforce, universities, and even for the time, we're very progressive in terms of things like women's rights. In which case, I am told that I'm ignorant, that, it's taqiyya, I'm being lied to, I'm being naive, I just don't really understand Islam. So the challenge I think that I have most is just that there is a lot of misinformation about the culture of Islam, for better or worse, the history of it. And I think that's right now, especially in the West, when the whole intersection between, these two cultures is relatively new. I mean, in Hong Kong, there's a much longer history of having, a fairly sizable Muslim population. I think right now the biggest hurdle to that conversation is probably getting information out there.
I have found faith to be a very personal experience and a personal journey, and I've found that reflected throughout growing up and throughout my career as well. So pre 9/11, my family is originally from Pakistan, settled in the outskirts of New York. People didn't know what these countries were and didn't know what Islam was. And that was frankly a very comfortable space for me because I was able to define it for myself. And I grew up in a very Roman Catholic town where many of the conservative cultural challenges were common. You're going to go to hell if you have sex before marriage, right? This is something that we discussed as girls in a broader context of people in a community of faith. Post 9/11, I think I had a moment that many other people did, which is it suddenly became a much more public faith, and the practice of it was publicized and then eventually politicized as well. I have taken it to be, I happen to be Muslim among many other things that I am, and it is a part of my identity. I don't shy away from it, but it's not the thing that I'm walking around. I don't identify as a Muslim activist. I think the best thing I can do in this space of education and community gathering and being together as progressives across the spectrum is just to show up and be myself. And that's part of why I identify as progressive politically as well versus conservative or right-wing. And I think that's constantly evolving. I have found inspiration and faith, as Ani said, often outside of the mosque. And as I now face raising a child who I want to impart these values and things that I liked about how I grew up, I'm starting to question what is the best way to be doing that and looking for those opportunities that are more aligned with my personal progressive values.
So mine's a little different because I grew up post 9/11. I was probably like 5 or 6 when that happened. So I spent my entire life critiquing Islam because that's all I saw in the media, and my understanding of it was very basic, even as a Muslim. So when it comes to like activism, I'm very openly like, yes, I'm a Muslim activist because it's important for us to critique the community from within the community. Because as an oppressed or marginalized group, those that are within it can, I personally think, do it better than those that are out of the community. Like, I'm not going to face the same issues of being called Islamophobic, or maybe I will, but also I'm Muslim, so I'm not really afraid of myself all the time. But
I'm a little scared of you.
So it's just, I think it's very important as a Muslim within the community to be critical of the community. But I also think it's my responsibility as a Muslim in these times to be careful of how I'm critical of the community, because anything that I say that is anti-Islam is going to feed the narratives that are feeding the rest of America. If I say there's a problem with homophobia in the community, anti-Muslim people are going to say, see, a Muslim said it, it must be true, all Muslims are homophobic. So we have to be very just careful as to how we advocate and critique the community, but I do see it as a responsibility.
I'm going to go first to you again, Lauren, if you don't mind. Is like you mentioned that imam that you related as progressive and reformist, but even within the context, for example, of the Muslim narrative, there are those that are also smart enough to use the progressive language just for their own political gain, because that's where the money is now, right? And so I think I'm just trying to also educate the audience as to, like, okay, everyone is chasing the money, right? And so, like, when we started 11 years ago, we were demonized. Like, I was ostracized. Like, how dare you call yourself progressive? I'm like, I'm sorry. I mean, if you don't support LGBT rights, then you're not progressive. So that's like the last checkbox. And yet now, when it was evident that Trump was going to be president, you had all these conservative people, men and women, coming out of the woodworks, pretending to be progressive and using our progressive language, like, oh, I'm for women's reproductive rights, I'm for LGBTQ rights, which, makes me fall off the chair. But so how do you decipher, when you have guests on, how do you decipher someone who's genuinely progressive and generally believe in those values on the human rights issues, for example, right? Yeah.
Well, I think there's an important distinction to be made between, the views you might have specifically because you're Muslim and ones that I guess just relate to your general political platform. And to me, like, if you look at someone like Maajid Nawaz, for example, he's very vocal about the fact that for him the idea of Islam, submission before God, relates very strongly to things like equal rights for all. And so I think it's, if you actually listen to these people and ask them about it, the way that they relate to God and to their fellow man, there's a lot of important distinctions that might come through. And what I think is so interesting about listening to this conversation is that there are the more that I've read about it, the more that I've listened to people like Imam Tawhidi, Maajid Nawaz, or someone like Ayan Hirsi Ali, who also came from the Muslim community, the more that I realize that there are actually quite a number of active progressive Muslims or Muslim reformers out there, but they are so often demonized, like you said, about not being Muslim enough, or sometimes even called anti-Muslim themselves. So I think it's important to actually just listen to these people first before we make our discussion. And I think the fact that there are specific conversations about, okay, you call yourself progressive, you call yourself a reformer. What does that look like to you? What do the issues like women's equality, what does that look like to you? Gay rights and equal opportunities for LGBT, what does that look like for you? I think we do need to get very specific with these conversations, because there are some people who, might call themselves feminists, for example. But, if you actually look at the policies that they're advocating for, what they choose to critique and not critique, it becomes very clear that they may say they stand for women's rights, but they turn a blind eye to where I think it matters a lot when it comes to what Muslim women in the world are going through.
Give an example.
One example that's very common is Linda Sarsour. She's an activist that is attached to the Women's March. And, there is the idea that just because there are bigger problems other places in the world, that doesn't mean we talk about the problems that are here, right? And that's absolutely true. But at the same time, if you're advocating for interpretations that have been proven to minimize the amount of freedom that women have, and if you've been shown to have affiliations with groups that advocate for things that strip away the rights or independence of women or minority groups, then I think it is natural for us to question how committed to progressivism and equality you actually are.
Nayyera, do you want to address?
I am far more forgiving of individuals having conflicts and holding cognitive dissonance among things, right? Like people can believe one thing and behave another. I am far more forgiving of that, in particular when it comes to faith, as people wrestle to it, than I am with power structures and the people who have the responsibility to be leading a community, whether you are a religious figure or a political figure. And that is where you really do, I think, have to hold people accountable. And that's the piece, not necessarily to name names, but I think that becomes a universal challenge in faith of the leadership that we have and their commitment to power and, frankly, patriarchy. And that is something that I think we can see, particularly in a country like the United States that has a history of being religious and having faith, more so than you see in other Western countries like Europe, that faith can be a powerful tool for organizing political action. It can be a very powerful tool for raising money and to getting and mobilizing people. And when you question that and say, well, who are the people who are at the table? Do we have women at the table? Do we have people of color or just any intersectionality at the table? They all, across the religious spectrum, start to freak out. So I think there are lots of bridges and lessons learned from Muslims in the United States to be learning from other community struggles. And that's where I think the renaissance of Islam will come forward, because we have that opportunity here in the United States in a way actually you don't necessarily in Europe or elsewhere in the world.
I guess to answer the part, like what determines progressive, like these American Muslims are saying they're progressive, not that they have to be. And I am far less forgiving. And if you're not intersectional, you're not progressive. And if you're not fighting for everybody's rights on all intersections, you don't get to call yourself progressive. So I think there is this renaissance of American Muslims being all about human rights and like advocating for themselves. But what about, like, are you talking about Black Muslims? Are you talking about immigrant Muslims? Are you talking about just you? And I think that is like so important, and for us to recognize that it's a blind spot in the renaissance of American Muslims. So if you're not advocating for all of these things across the spectrum, then I don't consider you a real activist.
And I would also add to that I think those on the political left seems to allow for that blind spot and for the convenience for Muslim institutions and organizations to utilize the political structures that are out there for their own political gain. And I think that needs to be challenged. Like, what have you really done for the community, and what have you really done for LGBT rights? And what's the program? Show it. Show us the money. Show me the money.
So why not join a religion that appreciates women's voice as opposed to silence women's voice?
Well, because the religion of Islam is supportive of a woman's voice. It's just the practice that's whack.
Why in a temple, not in a mosque?
That's a good question. I think you have to ask the mosque that.
Assalamu alaikum. Brothers and sisters, to all the Muslim women in the back and to all the Muslim men, let us stand against what is wrong and help removing the shackles of our culture that hindered the growth of Muslim women for centuries. I understand Islam to give gender equality. I believe Islam is the religion of beauty, the religion of freedom. But the immigrants, where we come from, the issue of gender equality is far behind. Tribalism, culturalism, all these have created a barrier. I don't believe there is any restriction based on religion, but unfortunately, as of now, the community is not ready for that move yet.
Okay, Jesse. All right, now we're going to get really juicy. I actually used to belong to this mosque for a while, and for some years, for about 7 years, I even sent my daughter to the Sunday school there. And so I have intimate and warm memories, but also not so warm memories there. And so the excuse of, I mean, I agree with what the Imam says. Obviously, he sees Islam as affirming of women's rights and all that good stuff. But the comment about the culture and the comment that our community is not ready, that's an excuse that's been used for more than 25 years. So
and not just in the religious context, right?
Yeah.
Martin Luther King said that the worst person is the white moderate who is okay with somebody else suffering because change might be a little too difficult. Change is hard. It's not easy. And somebody has to lead the way for that to happen.
Exactly. And so when we're talking about lead, he is the Imam. Lead already. And so this is, you have the theological basis to affirm what you're going to be leading, so why not lead? And so this is the challenge that we, within the Muslim community, we need to nudge and push and pull from within. I'm going to go first to Nayyera this time. So you had talked about the political structure, and that is going to be the difficult part about changing. I want to share a little bit about a conversation I had with an imam, a well-known imam, and I sat him down very privately, and I said to him, you know, I don't get you guys, meaning you American imams. You speak in one way, and publicly you speak in a different way. And for that reason, I actually have more respect for ISIS, because if they don't agree with you, they kill your ass. They live by their principles, okay? And you don't. And he really was shocked that I actually framed it that way. And basically, in a nutshell, I was saying you're a hypocrite for not living up to your Islamic values that you claim to champion. And at that point, he admitted that, yes, we should be more affirming of our LGBT brothers and sisters. And so, but that's a conversation that we had one-on-one. But that is not a conversation that's being had in public with their own congregations, because they know if they were going to raise it for whatever reason, well, actually for the reason that they've been perpetuating homophobia within the community, they're going to be thrown out. Right? They will be dismissed as a leader. Mm-hmm. So as leaders, there's a lot of issues within the Muslim community about hate speech, and I'm talking about this on a global context because we do a lot of work, I do a lot of work at the United Nations, and we challenge hate speech, not just from within the Muslim community, but from outside the Muslim community towards Muslim. It works, everybody's hating on each other, and this really has got to stop. And so when we talk about hate speech and how when faith is being used, it is really powerful. We have seen how faith was being used against the Jews, against all sorts of minorities, how the Rwanda conflict, how 1 million people got slaughtered within just over 3-4 days. That's crazy. That's hate. That's what hate speech can do. So let's not take that lightly. And I think as Americans or those living here in the United States, we really need to tune into that, and we need to see what history has taught us about hate speech. So when we're talking about structure, let's talk about the Saudi money that has influenced structure. And now that we know that Saudi, oh yes, we did kill him in a fist fight. Yeah, right. Really. I would like to ask Nayyera and the panelists what your thoughts, and then we're going to go to the audience because we have 30 minutes, and I would really like to have this to be an engaging conversation with y'all. It's like, how do we then nip this? How can we actually challenge the structures within the Muslim context, within the Muslim organizations, the American elite universities that are so well funded by the Saudis, and the chairpersons, the chairmen, who are very well funded by the Saudis, like Georgetown and Harvard and USC. How do we unravel that? And at what point do we say to them, okay, this is the moment to speak up already?
Yeah. For context, the Saudis have been very smart and insidious in how they've used their money to peddle influence and power. And that is not just in the United States, it is global. The House of Saud came to power maybe 60 or 70 years ago. And they came to power consolidated based on oil and started spreading what is actually not a liturgy or a actual jurisprudence of Islam. There's like 4 schools of thought. It's some mix of things called Wahhabism, that then they funded schools in countries they wanted to be their spheres of influence. My parents' country of origin, Pakistan, is a classic example. They had their money, they wanted influence, they used it and said, we're going to fund schools and we're going to teach this certain brand. And countries in need were happy to take the money. Similarly, in the United States, nonprofits in need, educational institutions in need, they're like, this is a great source of money. And not realizing what that ends up breeding. When you have such an extremist, ultra-Orthodox view, it is very easy when you present the world in black and white to then condemn anything gray. And unfortunately, most of the world lives in gray. And that is the challenge, I think, of any extremist ideology. And now you have an entire generation of people in various parts of society in what we call the Muslim world, and even here in the United States, of policy thinkers who are not Muslim, of people who are beholden to Saudi money, who feel we don't really necessarily want to challenge that. And actually, we kind of practice that ourselves and not living in the gray. My husband is black. His family converted to Islam in the 70s. So they have a very strong American tradition of Islam, which I love because it doesn't have a lot of the immigrant cultural baggage that my parents grew up with. And even his aunt has fallen into a mosque that is funded by Saudi Arabia. They, recruited Black American men when they were young to come to Saudi, give them a very particular understanding of the religion, and now they come back. And I see this beautiful American Muslim culture also being subverted by the Saudi cultural context. There is a brand of Islam, a long tradition called Sufism, which is what my family grew in which music is an important expression of faith that now is being condemned in parts of Pakistan, even though that was a very indigenous expression of the faith. And I worry that I see that here, and the US government, back to Bush, even parts of Obama, has been, and clearly the Trump administration has been absolutely complicit in that. So that is the part where the American power can have an impact, and we have ceded that authority to the Saudi regime.
Lauren?
Well, I think when we're talking about power structures and Saudi Arabia, I mean, it's very easy to see how money comes into play for this. And, Trump has been, from day one, very if it's Islamic radicalism, we're going to call it Islamic radicalism. And then on the other hand, my good friend, the Saudis, right? And I think, which is the strangest thing. But when it comes to, I guess, being able to point to what is a totalitarian regime and say, no, this is unacceptable, I'm not a fan of many of the things my Canadian government does, but something that I was that made me very proud was that they were one of the few countries who were actually willing to call out Saudi Arabia for the human rights violations that they have been doing, which I think needs to happen more often. And you know, I'm not an interventionist. That doesn't mean I think we should start yet another war in the Middle East or anything like that, but to at least be able to say, this is what's happening and this is unacceptable. And, you know, so that I think from the issue can, I guess, be compromised by things like finances. But on the other side of it as well, what I think makes people a little bit hesitant to touch upon this is the fact that there is this assumption now where if you don't accept every aspect of Islam, then you are intolerant. And an example of this is Justin Trudeau, who is now our Prime Minister. When he was campaigning, he often calls himself intersectional and welcoming, but he so welcoming that he actually went to a Wahhabi mosque and said the Shahada, which, I mean, he did. I don't think he knew what it was. I don't think he knew that that is, the profession of faith for Islam. I think he was just trying to be tolerant and together, but you can't, call yourself a progressive, like's been said so many times, but at the same time, do things like apparently affirm Wahhabism and things like that. And I guess like within the Muslim community, I think it is important to make that distinction between what people are doing because they're Muslim versus what is just their culture. And yes, it can be used as a crutch for some people to excuse, oh no, this is just my culture, the way it does it. But it's also an important tool for, I think, many Muslims out there to be able to say, okay, am I doing this because, this is what God wants and this is what, I guess what's been written in the Quran, or am I doing this simply because it's the cultural norm? And if it is just the cultural norm, then maybe we can start to deconstruct things a little bit.
So I guess in defense of my Muslim brothers and sisters to talk about how this affects us as a community, it's really critical for the Muslim community and for especially those outside of the Muslim community to recognize the difference between Islam as an political ideology, which is what we were talking about, which is what the Saudis are enforcing, Islam as a faith, and Islam as law. And I think all of those things get conflated far too often. And when people ask, is Islam a religion of peace? Even having to ask that question, you're conflating Islam as a faith, as a spirituality, versus Islam as a form of government. And you see that everywhere. It's not just Muslims. You see that with Judaism in Israel. You see that with Christianity in America now. So it's just, I think, really critical to focus on our rhetoric and how we're using our rhetoric to discuss these issues, because we can't ignore the issues, but we also can't just talk about these issues and ask these questions with an already preconceived notion of what we think Islam is and what we think about the Muslim community. And I think that's critical from both within and outside of the community, particularly right now outside of the community, because Muslims in America are marginalized and they're oppressed. So if I'm constantly saying support Muslims, do this, it's because I'm a Muslim, so it's not taken as seriously. So we need those with privilege to be also recognizing these things and saying out loud, Islam as a faith versus Islam as an ideology, and which one of those is violent and which one of those is not, and whether or not the people subscribing to them are also violent.
I'm going to segue into your deconstruction of what is faith and what is culture. If we can, Jesse, go to the next segment, please. Because this is our way as progressive American Muslims deconstructing Islam from the faith, from the culture perspective. Is it good?
صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. Amen. The path of those whom thou hast favored, not the path of those whom earn thine anger, nor of those who go astray. You guys good? This is like sharing each other's screws. I would love to use that as the perfect example of what an American interfaith wedding should be. Yeah. Alhamdulillah.
When we first met, we knew that we had different faiths.
Yeah. Love doesn't choose.
Yeah.
Right? We had a number of conversations. At the end of the day, all the three Abrahamic religions have the same thing in common: love and respect for other human being.
I know a lot of people have asked their partners to like convert and so that they could have an Islamic wedding.
I told my husband, I don't want you to convert. You have the right to be who you want, believe whatever you want. But unfortunately, some of my family members didn't take it very well at all. And my mom still doesn't. And my husband did it to keep the peace.
I now present to you Mr. and Mrs. Landau.
There were a lot of imams who wouldn't do interfaith marriages. I was really excited, one, not only because you were a woman, and it was really important for me to have that represented in Islam, and to find a woman imam was like, good luck, like you can't find it.
Some people will ask, what gives you the authority?
You don't need to have authority. The Quran gives me that authority. So that's the deconstructing, separating the religion from the culture, because it is what dominates the narrative that a Muslim woman cannot not marry a non-Muslim man, which is actually not true. It's actually a tribal interpretation, which we're still living here now in the 21st century in the United States. And so as American Muslims, we're deconstructing that. So I want to, I think, I don't know if you have anything to add to that segment, but
I wish you'd done my wedding. I didn't know she existed before this. And in fact, I hated what my mom did at my wedding. Actually changed my name because he felt like it. I didn't change my last name when I got married, and decided to tell everybody that my status had now been elevated in the light of Islam. And I was like, oh, this is my wedding. So it is, like I said, the faith, finding a home in faith is often a struggle for many of us who are progressive, regardless of what the faith is.
And I guess going off of that and just what you were saying earlier about the fact that, Muslim advocation from within the Muslim community can sometimes be dismissed because it's just because it affects you. Something that I thought was really great was that my church, when I'm Christian, and my church from when I was back in university, they actually had a interfaith fellowship with, I guess, the Muslim community who was there because of our partnership with a Jordanian university. And I think a lot of the, I guess, very, very fierce rhetoric against the Muslim community now is actually coming from the Christian right. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's a lot of misinformation out there and a lot of, I guess, ignorance and just otherness when it comes to Islam. But if we look at, I guess, the tradition of Abrahamic religions, there's so much in common that we share doctrinally in terms of theology, of the nature of God, our relationship to Him, our relationship with each other, that is just not talked about because there are cultural barriers in the way. And so I think that deconstruction is really important, especially when we're looking at a country like the U.S. or even like Canada, most Western nations, where people are coming from a Judeo-Christian background. The tradition of Islam has a lot more in common than, some even perhaps secular humanist atheist movements that we have right now. But for some reason, there's that barrier between existing faith communities here not wanting to include Muslims into it. And I think a lot of that has to do with perhaps a misunderstanding or the idea that, you're anti-female rights because I saw some guy on TV, therefore you all are.
Yeah, orthodoxy and right-wing and conservatism, again, it's that black and white thinking, is very easy to organize around. And I think progressives, even in a political context, find ourselves flat-footed because we want to argue ideas and we don't actually move with emotion. So we need to have more emotion about what we feel the world needs to look like. Otherwise, we're not going to exist anymore. And these really right-wing strains of nationalism and populism, of everybody being exactly the same in lockstep, is what's going to dominate.
Yasmin, you want to add anything to it? No. I usually say, why don't the right-wingers of all the denominations just go get a bed, go get a hotel room somewhere and just get out of your system already?
Yeah, there's actually a TV show called Little Mosque on the Prairie. It's like so old, but it's
Canadian.
It's Canadian, yeah. But there's a scene where there's a super conservative Christian dude and a super conservative Muslim, and they like hate each other until there's like a gay pride. There's something to do with like gay rights, and they both like walk away like basically like off into the sunset because they both like hate the gays together, and it's like that's what that means.
That always brings them together. Yeah. Can we have the lights on, and can we have audience in a Q&A, please? Would love to have questions from you. Don't be afraid to ask any tough questions you may have.
So this one's for, I guess, the panel as a whole. So the other day I was in my political science class, and I criticized Louis Farrakhan's remarks, obviously vile anti-Semitic remarks, calling Jews termites, which was really gross. And then some people labeled me an Islamophobe. And I went on to say, well, look, I really cannot judge anyone based on their faith. I actually had said nothing about Islam as a faith. So how would you respond to if you criticize one Muslim and now you're Islamophobic? How do you respond to that?
Right. I'm going to take 2 more questions and then we open it up.
Okay, so my question is I think that as progressive Muslims, it can be kind of hard because you almost have to fight a battle on 2 fronts. Like, how do you navigate through having to kind of prove to other Muslims that, you know what, you can be progressive, you can be Muslim enough, and do that, and then also navigate how outside of the Muslim community, you're also viewed in a very particular and specific way, and trying to prove to them that Muslims aren't this like crazy radical group of people and they're normal. So how to navigate the idea that on 2 different sides of the spectrum you have to prove yourself.
How do you think we as young Muslim Americans and young Muslim women in particular, what can we do to kind of further the progressive agenda and kind of include the idea of feminism and more modern takes on Islam, like choosing not to wear the hijab or choosing to wear different clothing? What's our role and what's our responsibility, and how do we respond to interpreting the religion in a new way?
Thank you. If I can answer one question real quickly, and that is the one thing that I always do that cannot be used by either side, or that advances the progressive or the critical thinking aspect of Islam and within the Muslim community, is to say, look, when I said in the documentary, for example, the first female imam was appointed by Prophet Muhammad. So what's the problem, right? And the fact that the thing is, we are never attacked by the scholars of Islam because they know better. They know what we're doing and what we're saying is actually justified theologically speaking. And that actually negates a lot of the political right or those who are anti-Islam in itself to say that, oh, I guess Islam isn't misogynistic. It's just the practice. So every time when I am self-critical about the way Islam is being practiced by Muslims, now that's the important distinction to be made, by Muslims, then you have to just frame it from a positive theological framing, and that basically is a positive narrative that gets out there. Positive narratives are very difficult to, it doesn't mobilize people as hate narrative, unfortunately. And to answer the rest of the questions, I leave it up to the panel. Your take.
I'm sorry you had that experience. That really sucks. And I'm still trying to figure out how I would answer that. I'd be like, Louis Farrakhan doesn't speak for me. And are you actually trying to suggest that Islam is... I'm Islamophobic because I criticize anti-Semitism, therefore Islam is anti-Semitic? Like, what? So I don't know. I hope these folks aren't your friends, and that's college, right? Like, I'm like, that's just, that to me is like the epitome of people trying to figure stuff out in college. I don't bother to navigate it. I don't bother to think about it. I've just, especially now that I'm a mom and I work and all this stuff, I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to be. I don't need to prove anything to anybody. If I don't need to prove it to my parents anymore, I got over that hurdle a while ago. I certainly don't need to be proving it to random strangers or other people who want to define me for myself. And I think that's just a journey of a woman and an adult, particularly in your 30s, is when you start owning who you are and you gravitate towards the people that affirm and support who you are versus trying to find meaning everywhere else. And that's a part I think that actually faith has also really helped me navigate. And for Muslim women, again, I think that's similar. I also call it the social courage to speak up. I think if enough of us have, for me personally, LGBTQ rights are very important. It was a thing when I was dating men to marry that I was like, if you can't back this up, this is not going to work. Like I can't be with somebody who's not going to be okay with the fact I have gay friends, or just kind of make it a passing thing, that they don't genuinely embrace these people as part of our network and family. And it worked. I found somebody who identified as Muslim, did a lot of the traditions I did, and felt similarly. So I think find those people that you have that in common with and make that your own personal community before you start trying to challenge the bigger one. So you don't feel alone and abandoned. But also there are people out there who will support you in whatever it is that you want to do with your life.
Well, to your, I guess, question, something that I found really interesting about people who hurl around the, I guess, accusation of Islamophobia is that it's often very indicative of what they think of Islam, right? Because if criticizing someone who made an anti-Semitic remark makes you Islamophobic, what does that mean you think Islam believes, right? And it's the same thing, if you criticize, something like female genital mutilation and you get called Islamophobic, again, what in your mind, then, what is Islam's position on female genital mutilation as a whole? And, I think that it's important to then maybe perhaps, if it's appropriate, press them a little bit about why would you think that this is inappropriate to say? Do you think this is something that represents all of them? And, I get similar accusations anytime we talk about, one of the ISIS stories or something like this, or Boko Haram. A lot of people will say, oh, you're going too hard on the Muslims. And it's like, most of the people worldwide who die because of extremism are actually Muslims themselves, the people who live in those populations who are being terrorized night and day by these groups. In that situation, maybe not in a college class, because, the professor, power dynamic thing there. But yeah, probe them about how that relates to what they think of Islam, perhaps.
Yasmin?
To answer your question, same thing. I don't have anything to prove to anybody anymore, but that takes a lot of work to get to, because if you're on the cusp of two identities, you feel like you're never enough for either group. Like, I'm either too brown for the white people or too white for the brown people, too Muslim for the non-Muslims, too, what is the other, I don't know what I just said, but you get the point. So it gets to a point of just saying it, say I'm Muslim, that's that. I'm American, that's that. Like, are you really gonna sit here and argue with me and tell me that I'm not? Because, like, you have no authority in that. And it comes down to, like knowing your faith and just being stable in that. Like, someone's going to tell me I'm not Muslim because I'm in a miniskirt. A lot of people, I'm sure, are thinking it. But how are you going to tell me that when it doesn't say that anywhere? You don't know that. And it's all up for interpretation, and I think about that in everything. Everything is a living context. It's always up for interpretation, and you get to choose. Faith is choosing. You get to choose either the progressive stance or you get to choose the really hateful one. So if you have a choice, why choose the hateful one? And then going to you about what Muslim women need to do within the Muslim community, we need to talk about it. And it's not easy, and I say that from a place of privilege, because my dad grew up in America, so he already dealt with the first generation Muslim parents issue, so it was a lot easier for me. But it was hard. My parents said a lot of homophobic things when I was younger. So since 16, I'm like, gay rights are important, gay people are important. You can't say this stuff, Mom and Dad. And like, I think it was earlier this year, it was so sweet. My mom, we're not friends on Facebook, but she like messaged me on Facebook this video about the third gender in Bangladesh, because that's where they're from. And I was so worried. I was like, Mom, like, are you about to say some homophobic stuff? Like, I don't have the time for this. But it was really sweet, because she was like, complete 360 as to where she was, or 180 for where she was before. And she's like, no, this makes me so sad. I'm so ashamed of Bangladesh that they're not like accepting these people and being inclusive. And honestly, if I had not been pushing it and like being this as black sheep like to my family since I was 16, that would have never happened. So it's really important to talk about it. Of course, protect your energy and don't like feel like you have to explain yourself every single time, because it's not easy and it's exhausting and the fight doesn't end. But you have to make an effort, because if you don't, it's not going to change. So when you go to the mosque and someone's mad at you for having nails, which has happened to me so many times, don't entertain it. Like, ask them what it means to them. Why does it matter? How do my nails affect you? And then maybe they'll think about it, maybe they won't. But if you don't do it, you'll never know. So.
And also, to also recognize how complicit often women are in the oppression of other women, yes. Right? Like Susan Collins, Kavanaugh probably would have gotten confirmed anyway, but Susan Collins like put the nail in the coffin with the way that she spoke out as a woman and spoke about another woman. So that is particularly insidious in religious communities, where often there are strictures and interpretations of how a religion and how authentic you are and spiritual you are is based on what happens with a woman's body. And so to recognize that we do that to each other also. And so I've just gotten to a point where I'm like, you do you, boo-boo. You wear whatever you want, and if you want to be part of this craziness, I'll welcome you. Like, that's my only definition of people wanting to be Muslim and counting them as in. You want, great, we'll take you. And it took a minute to get there because, right, like when you're part of a group, there are things that define you and then the other. And so it's hard to get there, I think, within the context of faith when it is designed to be somewhat exclusive.
Well, I guess like it kind of goes to the idea of like women oppressing women, like politics aside, something that I've been, I've talked about before and I've been sort of, criticized for is the whole idea of what constitutes Islamic versions of dress, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with. So I've had the, I guess, challenge of, trying to navigate the idea that, yes, I think women should be able to wear whatever they want, even if that means dressing how they feel is the most modest way of dressing, right? But at the same time, how do you also, I guess, talk about the fact that for a lot of these women, it's not what they want, it's what somebody else wants. So I don't know if you guys have any ideas about the most constructive way to do that, because I find oftentimes when I talk about it, I have people saying, oh, so you're anti-hijab then, so you hate this, and it's like, no, it's not about hating a particular style of dress, whether you want to wear it or not. It's talking about why someone might be doing it. I don't know if that makes sense.
I go back to, it's a very American principle, governments should not be telling people what to do in regards to their faith. So when you look at, and I think there is a freedom here in the United States for people to choose to cover or not cover and define modesty in whatever they want for themselves, or not modesty, whatever that means, in a way that does not exist elsewhere in the world. And that is a thing. I don't believe governments should be telling women that they should be covering. Again, particularly that the Muslim world, that was not a thing. That is a very politicized ideology interpretation of Islam.
But at the same time, I think it's also important to recognize we can't, especially in like an American context, I think what makes hijabi women or Muslim women upset is assuming that they didn't have a choice in it. So there's a difference between saying, you didn't have a choice in this, you're so oppressed, I need to save you, and maybe these ideas come from patriarchal ideas and we should talk about that. But it needs to be an equal spectrum, like maybe miniskirts are a patriarchal idea. Am I still choosing to do it? Yes. But we can't deny the fact that it comes from where it comes from. So I guess it's more about critiquing the idea and how it came to be versus you're oppressed because you think you're choosing to wear this, but you're not really choosing to wear this.
All right, I think with that, we need to wrap up. I want to highlight, we have some flyers. We have an event called Celebration of Life, February 10th, 2019, where we usually honor human rights defenders in the Muslim world who are jailed, tortured, or killed for being progressive. So a lot of times the media always asks, where are the progressives? I'll just Google, please. And in the Muslim world, this is what's happening to them, so pay attention. So what we're going to be doing is honoring a few other people at the Celebration of Life next year, and that would be the Khans, at the Democratic Convention. If you remember, there was a Gold Star parent who held up his constitution to Trump, I'll lend you my constitution. So that couple and National Geographic and KCET. And the third honoree is the president of Tunisia, who has been very vocal for women's rights, his initiative for giving Muslim women equal inheritance to men, which is going to be a profound change for generations to come, should that come to fruition. So we're going to be also honoring the many Saudi women who are in jail. I have a friend who is in jail for advocating for the right to drive and for women's rights in general, and Iranian women who have been advocating for their right to not wear the hijab, and a Sudanese theologian, Muhammad Tahar, who was a progressive and was killed for being progressive. So that's kind of like what we do, human rights, and we're going to do it in a poetic and artistic way, in a musical way, and I hope you can join us. Thank you for coming. Appreciate that.
Thank you all.